Welcome everyone to a brand new episode of Jam's Tea Podcast, where we spin the jams and spill the tea. This week we are going to be talking about two new albums. We're talking about the album from Moor Mother, Jazz Codes. We are also going to be talking about the new album from one of this podcast's, a couple of this podcast members' favorite bands, the Deer Hunter, their new album, Antimai.
Yes. So it's not really a week where there's a massive attention-grabbing releases, but these are, spoiler alert, two, depending on where you fall, I guess, good to great records, and they are both worthy of your time and attention. So we're going to hopefully sell you on them if you haven't heard them yet, and if you have, hopefully we'll be able to give you some interesting commentary on them too. We have had some great videos uploaded to the channel recently, just the day that we record this, but it will be a couple of days ago by the time you're listening to this. I uploaded a video that I'm very proud of, that I spent basically the entire week either listening to prepare for, shooting, writing the script for, or editing. A passion project that's basically just dominated this week purely because I don't have any work this week. So I decided to throw myself into that. And it is a full discography ranking of all 16 albums by legendary indie rockers Yo La Tengo, a band that mean an awful lot to me, and a video that I'm frankly just stupendously proud of. I put a lot of effort and work into the script and into writing about these records. I must have racked up something like 400 scrobbles for this one band in the last week. So yeah, it's been a lot. So check that out, please. I would love that to do even just moderately good numbers. And if we can get through to a few Yo La Tengo fans, I'll be really, really happy. So there'll be a link to that in the description, but you can find it on our channel page easily enough. Go and check that out. We also have a great record club that we put up this week on Tom Waits' Mule Variations, an absolute masterpiece, one of his finest records. And we discussed it in the context of what essentially makes Tom Waits a great songwriter, and how Tom Waits's amazing songcraft and musical skill can, in the hands of the wrong person, be absolutely spoiled. And the way that we illustrated that was by talking about Scarlett Johansson. Yes, the Scarlett Johansson, and her.
What the hell is she building in there?
And her Tom Waits covers album called Anywhere I Lay My Head. And so that was a really, really great and funny video that we got to discuss those records. Of course, last Sunday as well, we discussed the brand new album from Porcupine Tree, a huge, momentous podcore release. We talked about that one for an hour, and we talked about the great new album from Regina, Spektor too. So lots of great content on the channel at the moment. Plenty more coming too. In the coming days, we're going to be finishing up our Björk retrospective, talking about her last album, which is fitting because we've recently had the news. It's not officially announced yet, but she is going to be releasing a new record in the autumn of this year. So we will be able to bring the whole thing full circle and look forward to that very soon as well. So stick around. We've got lots of great stuff in the pipeline. But for today, I remember your smile. For today, let's talk about, first of all, as was per usual, what we have been listening to in the last 7 days. Jake, what have you been listening to?
I guess the biggest undertaking I have gone through this week is listening to the discography of the metal band Imperial Triumphant, who, if you're a longtime viewer of the podcast, will know Imperial Triumphant's most recent album, Alphaville, made it onto our 2020 Best of the Year list records, because Saoirse and I were really, really big fans of Alphaville, which in my opinion is sort of this band's crowning masterpiece of a record, which I did revisit this week. And yeah, still a perfect album in my estimation, an album that mixes a sort of really distinct wave of New York metropolitan black metal and avant black metal and jazz. And yeah, that's about as weird and unfriendly as it sounds. If you're like, it also kind of blends a really distinct style of like dissonant black metal. So if you're a fan of bands like Gorguts, for instance, and you also like it when bands get real fucking weird, this is a band for you. The blend is a little bit more smooth than you might expect, but they have slowly become one of my favorite metal bands because I had only heard one other record from them before this week, which is their previous album, Vile Luxury, which is when they really started incorporating jazz into their sound, which I really love that album. It's a great record. But if I had to sort of say what my discovery or one of my favorite discoveries that I've had this year with music, it's the album that came before that, their album Abyssal Gods, which in my estimation is even better than Vile Luxury. It doesn't have the sort of jazziness, and so it kind of doubles down on a sort of weird, dark ambient atmosphere that this band really likes to channel. Like, this is a band that really, really tries to make you both auditorially and like physically unsettled by their music, to like hear it and just be like, oh, ugh. And by my estimation, Abyssal Gods is the album of theirs that is the best at doing that. It's more of, I would say if you're going to like dive into this band, this would be the record to do it with, just because it is both substantive enough to get a sufficient sound out of that maybe their debut, the incredibly named Abominamentum, doesn't quite have the development for. But Abyssal Gods is certainly one of the best black metal albums I've heard in recent memory. An album I would put right there alongside something like Alphaville. It's a little bit more meat and potatoes, really, really aggressive, really, really nasty. I'm very much enjoying that. Listen to some of their EPs as well, which are worth checking out, like Incest and Goliath. And hey, we're probably going to be covering the new album from them that is going to come out very soon, Spirit of Ecstasy, which curiously enough led me to find out something interesting, which is that a member of this band, one of the guitar players, Max Gorlick, is the son of Kenny G. Yes, that Kenny G, who is going to be featuring on the new album. Kenny G is playing on their most recently released single, which is currently boasting a pretty fucking hefty 3.9 average rating on Rate Your Music. I have listened to that single. It is fucking nuts, and I enjoyed it greatly. So I very much look forward to us covering that. I sort of continued going through the discography of one Miss Kate Bush. Been really getting into her as of last year, been making more conceited effort to go through the rest of her discography, and knocked out two heavy hitters this week. Two of the remaining sort of like canon Kate Bush albums, that being Ariel and The Kick Inside, one of her more recent records and her first album. And you know, it's really interesting. If I had to pick what I would have thought of these albums before I listened to them, I would have expected my opinions to be reversed, because I ended up loving The Kick Inside and appreciating Ariel. Ariel is sort of this big kind of late career album that's like really ambitious. It's a double record where Kate Bush is sort of exploring this kind of, I won't say more ambient sound, but a more kind of stripped back approach to production for her that ends up being very like nature oriented, very much like I think Ryley at one point compared it to being like her equivalent of Julia Holter's Aviary. And that's certainly true, minus the like overwhelming maximalism of Julia's work. But this album, I won't lie, I found it occasionally very patience trying. There's a lot of moments here that really double down on repetition that doesn't really build all that much, and a lot of songs that are a bit stolid for my liking. And the stripped back approach to production is refreshing, but I find it to be various levels of successful. It's an album that I enjoyed overall, but something that just feels a bit too bare and also monolithic for me to truly get into. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, The Kick Inside is just banger after banger after banger after banger. There's something about the fact that Kate's vocal register when she was this young, which I think she started recording this album when she was like 19, something like ridiculous. Her very much younger vocal tonality lends a really unique quality to this album, which is just like, how did a fucking teenager write these fucking songs? Like, even the lesser, like 2.5 minute long songs on here still manage to fully develop themselves into something that feels really, really interesting. The songwriting in general too is just, it really feels like somebody slaved over these, and Kate was writing with the perspective that most 40-year-olds would be envious of, with songs like Them Heavy People or The Man with the Child in His Eyes, or the incredibly popular single Wuthering Heights. This is just a fucking-sational album. I would put this in the upper half of my ranking for Kate's stuff so far, and I expect that I will only like it more with time, frankly. So, I mean, a bit of a balance there with Kate's stuff, but highly recommend checking out both.
I'm sure you already know this, Jake, but that record got made because she was discovered and signed to EMI by David Gilmour of Pink Floyd. Yeah. Yep. So that's one of the coolest little stories, considering how kind of worlds apart the music that each of those people were making was. But yeah, she wrote a lot of those songs, I think, when she was as young as 16, 17, I think. But yeah, it was recorded when she was 19 and it was released the year that she turned 20. And it is one of those like child prodigy sort of albums. And I think weirdly one that's kind of gotten, I don't want to say underrated because I don't think that's the right word, but just kind of slightly overshadowed, I think.
Yeah.
And people kind of just think about, oh, it's the album with Wuthering Heights on it. But man, that thing just plays so well from front to back.
Yeah.
I adore that album so much. And as for Aerial, like, there are songs on there that I think are some of my favorite Kate Bush songs, like A Coral Room in particular, I think is one of her greatest songs.
Totally my favorite song on there. Yeah.
Yeah, and I particularly love the closing duo of Nocturne and Aerial as well. But the second half of the record, I think, is where a lot of people jump off. Whereas for me, that's when the record goes from like a good set of songs to like a really like fantastic soundscape. But
I agree with you there, actually. I think the second half is pretty demonstrably stronger than the first half for me. I think the first half is really like the approach to production is sort of the same overall, but like Kate leans into how good she is at handling that in the second half, whereas the first half, I think it's a bit of a clash. So at least I can.
The first half has also got the pie song, where she recites pie to like 100 places or something.
3H3 like you're just like, is this bitch gonna keep going? Is she's just gonna keep going? And then she does. I feel like Kate Bush really gets lost and kind of adrift amidst the world of progressive music, because I don't think she's really considered like a progressive rock musician just because she's very much like art pop as well. But the thing is that she was mentored and signed by David Gilmour and then went on to work with fucking Peter Gabriel, and fucking like she was like the person who her and Phil Collins discovered gated reverb with Peter Gabriel.
That's right.
So that sort of sound of, and she worked on Melt too.
Yeah.
So you have that, and it's just like, I feel like Kate Bush is sort of an important staple in that world that gets often overlooked for, I can't imagine what she's a woman.
Well, one of her most streamed or like beloved songs, I think, is the Peter Gabriel song "Don't Give Up" off of So.
Yeah,
which is just so funny to me because that is like so much more a Peter Gabriel song than it is a her song, but everyone remembers her on that song. But anyway.
Let's see here. Oh, I've been really getting into the metal band Blut aus Nord. BLUT AUS NORD, 3 words. They are from France, and they are basically known as some of the first pioneers of one of this podcast's favorite subgenres, atmospheric black metal. They have, frankly, an absurd catalog of records since 1995 that goes up all the way until 2022, and have been batting a very consistent average. It is not often where I manage to see a metal band on Rate Your Music that has been going on for longer than 20 years who don't have an album that sinks below a 3.0 average.
To be clear as well, this is an incredibly rimcore band. Like, this is just because like websites like Sputnik Music and Rate Your Music are just like, because of the nature of online music audiences and particularly the way they were like 10 years ago, there's a huge funnel towards like underground metal, and just like all kinds of forms of metal in general tend to be things that get like held up and rated highly, generally speaking. Like, if you look on any of these websites, like Album of the Year as well, like their charts, you'll often see like very obscure metal records are just popping up because they're one of the few genres that get kind of consistently highly rated. And Blut aus Nord are to me are like one of the, when I think of like Rate Your Music core metal bands, they're absolutely one of the first ones that come to mind. They just are one of those bands that definitely obviously were really beloved within their underground scene in the late 90s, but have kind of had a second life online, which is really, really interesting, because of the nature of, men on the internet, basically.
And may I say, it's also funny that like all of their slightly lower rated albums are the ones where they do like split LPs with other bands. So this is a band that has a decent amount of acclaim behind them. The reason I check them out is because some of their records are widely beloved by one of our mutuals, Pokey Gem. He has a lot of their albums at like, a 4.5 or a 5 out of 5. And I was interested because I came across them because they have an EP that is very highly rated, and I'm listening to a lot of EPs, which is why I have to discount a lot of what I've been listening to this week, because I'm saving that for a project down the line. But they have a career trajectory that isn't wholly unlike a band with a similar weird trajectory that's also very rimcore, very online and talked about, which is oh, help me out, that black metal band that also became an electronic band. Olver, yes, yeah. Very much in that line is that they have an EP with a fucking ridiculous title, which is, quote, thematic emanation of archetypical multiplicity, unquote, parenthetical, soundtracks for scientists of occult syncretism.
Right on, man. Live your truth.
That is a 2005 EP where they blend atmospheric black metal and trip hop. So naturally, I had to go listen to that, but I wanted to listen to some of their albums proper. And while they have multiple bolded, like older classics, they've got this sort of really revered run of 3 records that are all linked together called Memoria Vetusta. But I went for their 2 most recent albums, 2019's Hallucinogen and 2022's Disharmonium Undreamable Abysses. Hallucinogen is terrific. This is a very distinct flavor of kind of psychedelic black metal, something that I really, really like. And I heavily enjoyed this. But the standout here is this year, 2022's Disharmonium Undreamable Abysses, which has a killer title and a sick as fuck album cover that looks like fan art of the game Bloodborne. But this album, fucking yes. All of my possible superlatives. This has wormed its way into my top 10 of the year thus far, which is no small feat considering how many great records have come out. This is a sort of psychedelic, atmospheric black metal, dark ambient avant-garde metal. This is something that feels simultaneously incredibly ferocious, but deeply, densely atmospheric, to the point where you just kind of find yourself lost in it. It also, unlike a lot of albums like these, this band really know how to use themselves in moderation. It's not a long album. It's under 50 minutes, which never happens with albums like this. So it really feels paced and tightly controlled. Each particular song really does feel like a distinct kind of aggressive movement. And it's got like it's a very Lovecraftian album, if you couldn't guess by the album cover, but it has songs like Chants of the Deep Ones and Into the Woods and fucking Tales of the Old Dreamer. So it has this really like this really intoxicating aesthetic to it that's really, really appealing to somebody like me. And I've listened to it multiple times this week, and I've only grown to love it more with each subsequent listen. If you're an enjoyer of atmospheric black metal in any sense, and you really like the atmospheric part of that, then go for it. I think this is a great album. One of the year's highlights, without a doubt. And I know Pokey Jam agrees with me. So yeah, definitely check that out if it sounds like your bag. I finally listened to my next record when I am doing my little deep dive of the noise rock band Lightning Bolt. I finally listened to, I think, what is considered like the one of their first sort of canonical classic, which is Wonderful Rainbow.
Yes.
Wonderful Rainbow, their 2003 record, which I mean, I threaten on just saying the same shit about every Lightning Bolt album.
It's another great Lightning Bolt record. A slightly more primitive one as well is probably the most notable thing about it.
This is sort of the first album of theirs that I've listened to that sort of doesn't benefit from a more modern studio production. And I expected that to be something that sort of held me at arm's length. And while I don't like Wonderful Rainbow as much as Sonic Citadel or Fantasy Empire, this is still an album that if you like those records, I cannot imagine any reason as to why you wouldn't love this as well. I mean, it just has multiple canonical great noise rock songs in it. Highlights for me are the
Two Towers.
Two Towers.
It's a fucking one of my favorite Lightning Bolt songs.
These songs are like a lot of them are still like really dense, really heavy on repetition, but they managed to make it work. Songs like Assassins and Dracula Mountain are just, you know, pulverizing. But Crown of Storms and Two Towers are two songs that feel incredibly dynamic, sort of a sign of things to come. And they just beat the shit out of you for 40 minutes. And it just fucking rules. This is really textural noise rock that I really, really get a lot of mileage out of. The primitive recording only really enhances that kind of sense of raw power. And I just really, really admire this band being this proficient this early on. The only albums I have left are their debut Ride the Skies, Hyper Magic Mountain, and Earthly Delights. Ever since I listened to their newest album, their 2022 self-titled, and Ryley sung this album's praises as well, the self-titled Artificial Brain album, I've been really, really, really seeking out a lot of tech death. Like my entire music library right now looks like it's like 70 EPs, like 40 tech death albums, and then like 60 more EPs. But I went out and sought out some stuff, but I figured I would at least familiarize myself with Artificial Brain, just because I really like their most recent record, and their other two albums are similarly very well regarded. So I took it upon myself to listen to their second album, which seems to be the one that people like, I guess, the least, as well as their EP, which is amazingly titled Butchering Cosmic Giants, which is a great little EP that I would highly recommend. But their second album, Infrared Horizon, in 2017, which I listened to, and I guess is a bit of a hot take, but I actually do prefer this to the self-titled, albeit only narrowly. But this has, I have a feeling it's because this is like the catchiest material I've heard from this album, the most accessible, and I guess, you know, the fans of this brand of dissonant fucking death metal probably don't take too kindly to that. But that's not to diminish the fact that this album still absolutely beats the fuck out of you. The second track, Synthesized Instinct, and excuse me, the album's highlights, Mist Like Mercury and Graveyard of Lightless Planets. Huge highlights from this band for me. This is a terrific album that you should not overlook if you got into the band this year. Highly recommend checking out their previous stuff just because it is at least of comparable quality, but this is really harsh, fucking just dissonant, brutal tech death. And it's almost like blackened to an extent, which is why I can see why this band seems to be catching on with like a modern audience, is that it pushes the sort of limits and extremes of this genre, which I mean is impressive in and of itself, but feels like that kind of harkens back to when Ryley and I, when we talked about Porcupine Tree in our last episode, are sort of like talking about how modern music listeners, how like no matter the genre, are looking for different incarnations of an extreme sound, of a sound being pushed to its absolute limit and then being consumed by them because they want to sort of get a feel for all of the really standout parts of the genre. And if you're somebody like that, can't recommend Artificial Brain enough. Even if you're not into tech death, if the fact that this, like, you know, just be like, oh, well, it sounds like really extreme and like really heavy, it is. But if you're somebody who seeks out actively sort of that kind of brutal throttling experience from other genre acts, you have no excuse to not check into this as well. Highly recommend. And their first album seems to be a record that a lot of people really love. Labyrinth Constellation. I'll be checking that out probably this week, I would imagine. But yeah, Artificial Brain, fully recommend and endorse them as well. And yeah, that's pretty much what I've been listening to this week.
As I forecasted at the top of this video, most of what I've been listening to this week is the 16 albums of Yo La Tengo on a kind of continuous cycling loop. And so I haven't had a lot of time for other things, but I have done some other listens, and there are some things that I do want to shout out. And the very first thing I want to shout out is an album that's coming out, that's out now. It would have just come out this week, from a mutual of mine on Twitter who sent this record to me because they thought I would be interested in hearing it. And this is an artist who goes by the name Water Gun Sky Attack is the name of his
there you go,
one-man band. And the style of music is, this is how he pitched it to me. And then when I listened to it, I was like, the way you pitched it is exactly how it sounds. So it's like, it's a fusion of Ortecker and Proto Mother. It is like,
what? That's a cheat code.
It's like electronic, very glitchy sort of IDM influenced shit with the singer, this mutual of mine, Tim, whose voice is basically identical to the dude from Proto Mother, doing this kind of post-punk style thing. In terms of themes and style, it's a very queer record. It's about like, it's got some strong themes of gay sexuality and exploration, all that sorts of things, and angst and all that kind of stuff. It's a very difficult listen at certain points. Like there's a lot of, it's rough around the edges in a way that's clearly intentional, because Tim is very clearly like someone who's very experienced in music production and is going for a particular style that is quite alienating in a lot of ways. Like it fuses these two sounds together and is so like earnest and sort of hard on sleeve that I think it'll put a lot of people off, particularly the vocal style as well, which can be very kind of cloying and just sort of in your face. I was able to vibe with it. It is a record that may just not appeal to some people at all, but I think that it is definitely worth checking out if that description intrigues you. It's available now on Bandcamp and I presume on streaming services as well. A really interesting record, worth hearing just for the sonic fusion alone. Like, even if you don't end up enjoying it like I did, the sonic fusion itself is really, really fascinating. And it is a really, really, really interesting record that sounds like nothing else, essentially. So gets a big shout out from me. I'll put a link to it in the description of this video. Shout out to him. Congrats on the album. The album is called Total Swarm for Young Lovers, I believe. And it is absolutely worth checking out. Next thing I'll shout out is something I mentioned in the Yo La Tengo video is one of the bands that really influenced Yo La Tengo early on. In fact, the band that kind of inspired Ira Kaplan and Georgia Hubley to start Yo La Tengo in the first place is the kind of power pop / post-punk band, the Feelies, who were, you know, mildly big in the early 80s, kind of like a sort of antsy, sort of Talking Heads-esque, Gang of Four-esque sort of band. Really, really strong focus on rhythm section and minimal groove. They don't have the same sort of pop appeal of Talking Heads, but they have the same sort of kind of like angular energy. They are very much like a music nerd sort of band. Like, if you can really appreciate really tight rhythm sections and just carefully arranged minimal arrangements, you'll really, really dig the Feelies. And I listened to their first and most beloved album, the excellently titled Crazy Rhythms. It's a really, really strong record. I really, really enjoyed it. It is a record, I think, that it has a lot to offer, but also I don't know that it rewards re-listens as much as some of the as I was maybe hoping it would. But it does have some great songs on it. It is worth checking out. Loveless Love is an amazing song. Forces at Work is great too. Moscow Nights. However, the big thing that's worth checking out on here is that they do a cover of the Beatles' White Album deep cut, Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except Me and My Monkey. And so this is on the White Album, a completely unremarkable song, kind of annoying, frankly. Yeah. There's a few songs. There's a few songs like that. But the Feelies, to their credit, transformed this song into like something fantastic. And it's one of the absolute highlights of this record, an unequivocally great song, and just blows the Beatles' tossed off draft out of the water. So yeah, even if you don't have the, I guess, willpower or energy to listen to this whole record, check out that Beatles cover. It actually transforms a song that was very clearly just a sort of sketch into something fuller and more satisfying. So yeah, the Feelies, Crazy Rhythms, gets a big shout out from me. So last week we reviewed the brand new album from Regina Spektor, Home Before and After, a record that I've grown to love dearly. And I spoke about it and we had a great conversation about it. And it inspired me to want to go back and dig into some of Regina's earlier records, most of which are even more beloved than this new one is. And so I listened to her last album from 2016, Remember Us to Life. And I listened to this album 3 times this week. And every single time it gets better and better and better. I think that it is definitely, not definitely, but for me, it is a stronger record than the new one. It is a more consistent record than the new one, more importantly. But also, like, the songwriting here is utterly sensational. Like, it is one of the things I posted on Twitter while listening to it is it's the kind of album that I feel like an artist like Lorde wishes they could make, like, but benefits from, I guess, the sort of the years that Regina's lived, the ways that she's kind of refined her songcraft up until that point. It is an utterly fantastic singer-songwriter record. It is just laden with hooks, great piano playing as well, like Tori Amos-esque vibes, but really kind of channeled through this innate sensibility that Regina has for great hooks as well. There are a few moments on the record that are a little bit more daring, like some of the songs that we talked about on Home Before and After, but I think that she pulls them off more consistently. And just generally, it's really sharp, really strong, really emotional, really powerful, and really fun. So Remember Us to Life is probably the best new listen for me of the whole week. Absolutely great, fantastic record. I also spent some time catching up on all 5 entries in the Deer Hunters Act pentalogy, I guess, to prepare for the review that we're about to do for their new record. And I'd already heard the first 3, but I refreshed my memory on those and in fact enjoyed, well, Act 1 is kind of just sort of like a prologue more than a kind of fully fledged record anyway. Yeah. But Act 2 and Act 3 both grew on me considerably. More so Act 2, surprisingly enough, because I wasn't expecting to enjoy that as much as I did. because it is a really long record, and I think it's maybe the longest of the 5. But for me, it has a certain energy and kind of edge to it that really kept me enthralled the entire time. And I also listened to Act 4 and Act 5 for the first time, both of which I loved, particularly Act 4. Sensational records.
My favorite.
The only kind of real critique I can lob is such a boring one, which is just that they're both a little too long. But I don't even like to say that because they have such a sweep to them that there's no point at which I'm like, oh, can I skip this? Or I want to get moving, because they're so well paced and well measured. It's just that I do think that some of the songs in the back half of both 4 and 5 do sort of add a bit of padding to the length of the record that does mean that I am a little bit off from fully adoring them. But, that said, there is sensational, stellar highs on these records. I mean, Act 4, the first half of Act 4, right up through to A Night on the Town, like that first sort of 6 tracks, just absolutely fucking steamrolled me.
The best thing that my favorite run of tracks this band has ever made.
Yeah, 100%. And I'm also a big fan of between Act 2 and Act 4, the Bittersweet series. I think those are some of the best, my favorite songs that this band have put out. And I just wish you guys could have seen my face when I was listening to this album and King of Swords Reversed hit. And it's just like, I've been listening to this like, very ornate and awesome, sort of very theatrical, emo influenced sort of progressive record. And then this fucking flat banger song just kind of kicks into the speakers, and it's like, wow, this is like,
let's go, fuck you.
Yeah, it's fucking awesome. I love that shit so much. An absolute standout. So yeah, love that stuff. And Act 5 as well, I thought was a really, really nice summation and a really, really satisfying conclusion. Again, starts out really, really strong with the first 4 tracks in particular, but also has some deep cut highs that are some of my favorite songs from this band, like Light and The Flame Is Gone and The March. Those are fantastic songs. So yeah, really enjoyed this series, and I'll give it a little bit more context to where I'm at with this band when we talk about the new record. But the last thing I have to talk about today is, of course, those of you who have been listening with some regularity may remember that a few weeks ago, we did a great Jams and Team Music quiz, and Jake won, and as a result got to assign me, Morgan, and August discographies of artists of his choice that we had to listen to and review week by week. And so last week I was slack. I didn't get around to listening to and processing the first album from the discography I was assigned, which is the discography of Muse. But I have caught up, and so I have re-listened to the debut album from Muse, 1999's Showbiz. And the thing about this record is, so it's generally the narrative of Muse, the conventional narrative is that they were, they started out as this really exciting, bombastic, larger than life rock band with these kind of huge stadium ambitions, and they kind of reached and scaled those heights. And then they just kind of, essentially the narrative is they just kind of like disappeared up their own ass and became like the kind of inevitable, I guess, trajectory of a band that is trying to do shit in the way that Muse are, trying to like be a significant, meaningful band that kind of just disappear into the ether, essentially. And we'll see how that narrative tracks with their new album, which is coming out soon. But that's the narrative of Muse, right? The early stuff, great. The late stuff, shit, they lost it. They just went too far. And while there are Muse records I like, I have significant reservations about fully embracing that narrative because, and we'll see how their most beloved records like Origin of Symmetry and Absolution and Black Holes and Revelations, all of which I have very fond memories of, we'll see how they hold up. But I have to say, Showbiz fucking sucks. I hated listening to this. I fucking hated listening to this. This was utterly fucking mind-numbing. And
I hope you just hate all of them. That would be so funny.
You're really funny.
So the thing about Showbiz is it's the roughshod debut, right? It's the Pablo Honey, it's the whatever you want to call it. You know, it's the record where the band are clearly sort of, they have those ambitions, they're sort of just gearing up, they're warming up, they're sort of settling into a particular mode. They are clearly of a time and like in relation to other bands more than they are their own thing at this point. And that's fine. You know, that's a debut record for so many bands. And obviously the comparison that gets lobbed at Muse for Showbiz is Radiohead. And certainly it is what I would term a post OK Computer album. It's an album where, you know, the effects of OK Computer, this landmark rock record that kind of shifted the face of alt rock, are obviously clear. There's no way that any new bands coming out around that time are not going to be influenced by that in some way. And I've seen a lot of people compare Matt Bellamy's vocals, particularly in the early era, to Tom York. And there are some similarities. They can hit similar sorts of registers when they go for that really whiny falsetto mode. And interestingly, the moments at which they sound alike are, you know, the moments at which they are at their most kind of melodramatic, which is interestingly something that Tom York basically stepped back from entirely, more or less, after OK Computer. You know, when you think of the similarities between Matt Bellamy and Tom York, it's really like you're thinking about Showbiz Matt Bellamy and you're thinking about the Benz Tom York. It's a shallow comparison, but it's absolutely one that I suppose has some weight. And the difference is that Matt Bellamy has a fucking terrible voice, and I don't give a shit that he was classically trained. I don't give a shit that he has, that his fucking, he wets the panties of fucking, girls with Oedipus complexes all over the globe. Like, I don't give a shit about any of that. Of course, he would refine his voice, and he does sound better on subsequent Muse records than he does here. But my God, is he annoying. He's the most annoying presence of this record. There's moments on this album, especially songs like Sober, where he's just doing this fucking terrible, shitty, fucking type shit where he sounds like he's constipated. And it's amelodic for starters, right? For someone classically trained, he has a stultifyingly dull sense of vocal melody here. Song like the first two songs, Sunburn, Muscle Memory, or Muscle, whatever it is, Museum, definitely the best two songs here. I think they're the most beloved songs on the record, generally speaking. And they're fine. They're good. I don't want to shit on poo-poo on them at all. Like, I enjoy them as much as I can enjoy any songs on a record that sounds like this. And then with the third track, Philip, and just on, it just fucking boom, it flatlines. It's just instantly pancakes right after those first two songs in a way that like really took me by surprise. I wasn't expecting, because when I had heard this album once before, years ago, and I had it rated, moderately as a sort of middling record. I remembered liking some songs, and it was interesting, like how the other songs I remembered, vaguely having fond memories of, like the title track and Uno, and I revisit them, and I just fucking can't. Especially Uno, which has this like interpolates this classical melody of the Blue Danube, or one of those sort of classical pieces of music into a sort of guitar melody, and makes that beautiful melody into something that sounds like monotonous and just sort of dry and dull. It's the kind of thing that if they did it now, they would like turn up the compression and layer on the crunch, and they would make it sound like Imagine Dragons. And they would definitely do that here if that was a thing in this time. But yeah, I mean, just completely, it's just a record that does nothing for me. And it is also, hurt by the fact that it frequently annoys the fuck out of me. And look, we'll see what happens with Origin of Symmetry, and I'm not, to be fair, I don't think I'm going to hate any of those next three records, because I've heard them a lot more than I've heard this, and I know them reasonably well. This was just a real like reality check, I suppose, into how, I guess, as I've grown, this is not like me saying that I've matured and become better than Muse or whatever, but as I've grown up, my taste
Well, I mean,
as I've grown up, my taste
I
has
like
sort
you
of
a lot more than Muse.
drifted away from this kind of music.
Jesus.
And I don't know. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. As I've grown up, my taste have just sort of drifted away from this sort of stadium rock. What? And I like stadium rock. I just don't like stadium rock that takes itself seriously, that has any ambitions of being like a world conquering force. I like stadium rock that's about like, driving cars really, really fast and having terrible sex. But, like Meatloaf is my kind of stadium rock thing. I don't want...
Bicycle, I want to ride my bicycle.
Queen. Yeah, exactly. Queen is just stadium rock about being a fucking... And that's my shit. I'm gonna have to say
Bicycle is his boyfriend.
Yeah. Right. That dick Muse are like a kind of band like Coldplay in the sense that the more they fuck up, the more shit they put out now, the less forgiving you are to their early stuff, which is good, but certainly where you're kind of like acknowledging and sort of looking past some of the limitations of it because of nostalgia or because of cultural significance or whatever. And then the more shit music they put out in the present, the harder it becomes to overlook the shallowness of their early work. And I think both bands are kind of in the process of doing that, of essentially kind of demolishing the sense of goodwill that I feel towards their early work by just continually pumping out shite.
Blowing it.
But anyway, yeah. And the thing I tweeted while listening to it as well was like, it's like early Muse, I guess Muse in general, I kind of like, they're like editors for jocks. Like I thought a lot of editors while listening to this record, which is another band that's like, have a very low ceiling in terms of like just, how good they can be. They're never going to be a great band, but their early work has a kind of primal, really straightforward but satisfying sort of post-punk influence rock edge to it that makes that stuff like a, just like a good sort of fast food equivalent of, better bands that you just want sometimes really hooky stuff that isn't, overly complicated or whatever. And Muse kind of early Muse kind of served that same purpose as early editors, but the difference being that like Muse step on their own toes a lot more frequently than a band like editors do, even though they're both kind of like, even though the frontman of both bands is kind of like a pretty pompous songwriter. Anyway, yeah, so that's my thoughts on Showbiz. I will be back this time next week to talk about Origin of Symmetry, a record that I know means a great deal to a lot of people. And so I will disregard all of that while talking about it. Anyway, that brings us to the first of our main reviews today, which is, of course,
Deer Hunter initially started out as a solo project of frontman Casey Crescenzo, who was a guitarist and vocalist for unfortunately short-lived post-hardcore band Receiving End of Sirens, who released 2 really excellent albums and then just bounced. But yeah, the Deer Hunter, best known for their long-running Acts series, Act 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, which are sort of like conceptually about as impressive as it gets for modern progressive music in terms of just scale. They're also known for the Color Spectrum, a 2.5 hour almost collection of EPs that explore different sort of nooks and crannies of the band's interests sonically. But yeah, so the last thing we heard from this band, besides some diversions, was Act 5, released in 2016, and sort of closed the door on the Act series, but also kind of left it open. Like, sometimes the storytelling is so esoteric on those albums that it's like, this definitely feels like the ending, to this story, but also like, you know, there could be an act 6. So in the 6 years between that album's release to their new album Antimai, there were sort of a lot of questions, a lot of speculation about what the band was going to do exactly. And as it would turn out, their first album in those 6 years is the start of a brand new concept series with plans to release the next part next year, actually. Basically, just a whole new world being cracked open for this band conceptually and sonically in a lot of ways.
It's worth noting that it's preceded by a short film / story, and I think a soundtrack record called The Indigo Child, which is kind of like the name, I guess, of this overarching story. And this is kind of like the first. So there is some sort of preceding materials that kind of, I guess, laid the groundwork. But this is, I guess, like the introduction proper to the concept, which kind of lays out this civilization that this big story is set within, and kind of introduces you, I guess, to some of the dynamics or places or archetypes that are going to be sort of like pitted against each other, I suppose, or interacting in some ways as the story progresses.
If I may say so, I think that just from the outset, I think this is a good decision for the band, not because I'm like dead set on Act 5 being the ending of this band's like previous arc. Even though I am somebody who is listened to the other albums so much that I do know what the story even like is at this point. But I wasn't opposed to them continuing it at all, but I like the idea of a new chapter for the band starting here and starting off like with a sort of, you know, laying the groundwork record, just because I think the inarguable weakest point, like at least from like a solid cohesive album standpoint of the sort of Act series, was Act 1's kind of like very brief and comparatively small scale kind of sound that they had that was just, you know, elaborated and expanded upon in each album that followed it, like way more. Like it feels like the sort of proof of concept for the band. So this sort of allows them to take everything they've learned over the years and start a new project, and then like really from the get-go have a really great idea of what they're doing, what they want everything to sound like and be like structurally. They don't have anything inhibiting them that maybe their very lofty ambitions at the start of their career kind of might have limited them. So like right from the get-go with Antimai, you get like this really big opulent sound. Like this is a progressive rock band that have sort of dabbled in everything. Like, I mean, the color spectrum has everything from industrial rock to like experimental electronic shit. So this is obviously a really versatile band, but like the main series is like progressive rock that's like really, really bombastic and really, really theatrical. And this sort of takes that and sort of doubles down on it. You immediately get like these very like these chimes on the opener and these really like big tribal drums, and everything about this project to me screams like, I do not say this in a disparaging way at all, like the musical theater-y side of prog, where it's like it's just really, really bombastic. It's really like you can imagine this being performed on a stage. And the cool thing about it is that I really do think that it gets a whole lot of mileage out of this, that kind of maximalism that Acts 4 and 5 really built the sort of backbone of their sound on. This kind of continues. And like it manages to, I would like broadly, I'd say that this is like a progressive pop album, just because the sort of hookiness of the songwriting and the memorability of the verses and what have you. This really sort of, you know, pops sensibility that like Act 5 still I think veered more towards prog rock, but this feels a little bit more accessible. And I don't think that's a bad thing at all, just because I always thought that this was a strength of the band that they had never fully capitalized on. And it manages to sustain the length of this entire album pretty solidly well. If anything, I think that Casey DeCrescenzo's voice has gotten better and better over the years. It's perfectly suited to something like this, immensely flexible, outstanding range. I mean, if anything, listening to the Deer Hunter is a worthwhile endeavor just to hear this man sing well, because you're gonna enjoy that no matter what, if this is, you know, your bag to begin with. And I guess the curious thing about it is that it's very upfront about its structure, because all of the songs are named, you know, it starts with ring 8 and then ends at ring 1, and they're called things like poverty, industry, middle class. And that immediately set off some alarms in my head, as I think it would anybody, because your first instinct is just like, oh no, are we gonna get like a really overly heavy-handed class conscience, like fucking, you know, comrade fucking shit here? And well, I won't say that the storytelling here is anything particularly new, or that this like makes any effort to sort of subvert these little ideas. It just sort of serves as a vehicle for this opening chapter of like a character who, it's like a Scorsese rise and fall. He starts at the bottom, he works his way up. And if anything, I can compliment the band on making the transition from A to B feel very tangible, because in each of these, you sort of see how the main character of this narrative is being kind of sucked into these various stages of this transformation. The sort of poverty sort of sets the scene as to where everything begins. And then when you go from poverty to industry, you see that industry is built off of this sort of community that everyone is singing about, that really kind of sucks the main character in, that sort of transitions him from one stage to the next. And it makes really good use out of sort of like these choir of gang vocals that's really like call and response kind of stuff. Same thing with stuff like Lowtown and Middle Class. You sort of see how this character is sort of taken from one place to the other. And then once you get to Patrol, it's basically the main character becoming a cop. And then, you know, sort of exercising his power on other people and continually justifying in his head why he thinks all of this is okay. And it makes for an interesting sort of like, you know, it does feel kind of like topical, but it never felt to me like it was so heavy-handed that it was just like annoying or whatever. It's well put together. It's not original, but it's sort of an interesting portrait of how someone can go from, you know, the dregs of society to being the upper class and continually justify themselves the entire way through. So in terms of like a narrative progression, I think that the Deer Hunter has a really tight grasp on what they want to do here. It's, if anything though, where I'm limited with this is that I just want to see what they're gonna do after this, because this is very meat and potatoes. It is very basic, but I know from their other stuff that they're gonna take this somewhere weird, or they're gonna take this somewhere different, and I'm just kind of frothing at the mouth to know where that is exactly.
You know, it's funny that I think we're basically going to give this record around about the same rating, but we also have our own scales. And so I think that even so, I maybe like this more than both of you, which is a weird place to be in with this band. So when I listened to this, I mean, I was struck for starters at what a kind of full, not necessarily, 180 degree or anything, but it's a radical shift from the sound of their previous records. It's still got that progressive spirit to it, that musical theater energy, which I would argue has always been present in all of their music, and is one of the great appeals for me of their music, because I feel like a lot of prog almost has too much pride, I guess, to indulge in that kind of thing. And I think that when that kind of thing is done really, really well, when a band just kind of leans into a love of just opulent and even flamboyant theatrics, it can actually be quite satisfying. And it's refreshingly, I think, unpretentious to see a band like the Deer Hunter do that, because while they are, telling these stories that are super layered, super dramatic, full of all these characters and this, sort of portent and drama, all that sort of stuff, it's never, I don't think, generally in the past, it's never really been heavy-handed, and it's never really felt like that it's taken itself overly seriously at all. Now, with Antimai, this is definitely, as you say, a record that shifts more to telling a story that's basically a kind of parable about class, about social strata, about, as you say, trying to rise through the ranks, and essentially forming a physical representation of class in the form of this Antimai civilization, city, whatever it is, that is literally separated by walls that separate the 8 different zones of the city, ring-shaped walls that separate the 8 different zones of the city. And as you get closer to the center, you get more and more wealthy, more and more kind of smaller spaces that are occupied by more and more powerful people. And as you get further out, you get larger and larger spaces that are occupied by more and more sort of powerless people who are, I guess, just cogs in the machine, more or less. And it's very, very straightforward and stuff. And
I thought of the Ben Wheatley movie High Rise multiple
oh,
times.
same. Yeah, I thought of that too. And I think this is, to be fair, a work that executes the idea of that a little bit more compellingly than that movie does. But
Yes.
But anyway, the interesting thing about this is that while I've always really, really enjoyed the storytelling of the Deer Hunter, and I enjoy it in the X series as well, I think weirdly enough that my favorite thing about this record is the music, and the storytelling and stuff is all great, but I actually am fully on board with basically every musical decision that they make in terms of shifting their sound here. What really surprised me is how heavily they've incorporated elements of R&B and funk music in ways that feel like they're kind of trying to do what a lot of indie pop sort of radio bands do now, like, I don't know, your Glass Animals or whatever, where they take a kind of pop template and they incorporate these kind of like, what I would term gentrified funk aesthetics.
They water it down.
And the credit to the Deer Hunter is that they kind of do their own version of this, but of course substantiate it and add more muscle and weight and creativity to the way that these aesthetics are deployed. And also, of course, they don't linger in any particular mode of this aesthetic for too long, it being a progressive album and all that. And it really gives this whole thing a fresh feeling. The one thing I didn't want from a new Deer Hunter record was a prog rock album, as weird as that is to say, because they've done that really well in the past. And I really wanted them to be able to kind of distinguish this new chapter musically and, of course, in terms of the story as well. And I think they've really done that exceptionally well. I am musically engaged and satisfied with every single track here. I don't actually really think I have any musical complaints at all. My only reservation...
There's not a real definable weak point on here for me. There's not a moment where they're not like really tightly reining in all of their musical instincts.
And even the songs that are kind of like split into 2 parts, like Middle Class and Luxury, where you kind of have these two, they're one song, but they're kind of like have these 2 different sections within them that have their own kind of different musical explorations of the theme of the song or of the ring of the society that they're talking about. That I thought was really, really well done. It is like a record that is, I suppose it seems like a really short album for the Deer Hunter because we're so used to these 70+ minute records, but it's 50 minutes and it manages to cram a lot of value and interesting ideas and regular change ups and just smooth and tasteful executions of what's happening musically really, really well. My only reservation with this album is I think that the lyricism at certain points can kind of be a little bit too on the nose. I feel as though in trying to establish this concept, a lot of the time, the way that Casey writes is in a way where it's like he's trying to make sure you understand like the particular social, world that this particular ring represents and the mindset of the characters in it. And he does it by speaking from their perspectives or speaking from the protagonist's perspectives in ways that feel very expositional, right? So it feels like a lot of the songs, the writing is very much just like very two-dimensional, and it's about, I am in this position and I'm looking down on these people, or I'm looking up at these people, and I'm thinking this, or I'm evil, or I'm going through this angsty moment, or I'm like da 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 da, and it feels a lot of the time very rote from a writing standpoint, and it's in a way that I don't think Casey has been in the past. He's never, I think, been an all-timer songwriter, but he's he had, and of course, like, to a certain extent, this kind of directness and bluntness is, is fitting for, the sort of overblown musical theater music that the Deer Hunter makes. You don't necessarily want super oblique lyricism in music like this. But there were certain points on tracks like Industry and Middle Class and Patrol, where I did feel that again, two-dimensionality and simplicity of the lyrics definitely felt as though they were maybe robbing the tracks of a kind of greater depth that they could have had if the themes and ideas were explored in a way that felt a bit more nuanced. And I think that, to a certain extent, the way that these songs have turned out is very much a product of Casey wanting to, lay the groundwork for this concept in a way that's easy to grasp, because it is a dense concept, right? You've got these 8 different sort of strata, these 8 different parts of the society that in each of them, he wants to establish very clearly what it represents and what, is happening there. And so he's got a lot of legwork to do in the context of a record that is 50 minutes and is cycling through all these different musical ideas as well. So in some senses, like, it's just a cost of having to do that. And I'll be interested to see whether the storytelling gets a little bit more, ambitious, or a little bit more, I think, refined and really adventurous with the next installments in this series. I hope it does, because that's really the only thing that's holding me back from, frankly, calling this an unequivocally great record and very, very close to their best, in my opinion. That aside, if you do kind of sort of tune that out a little bit, it is great. It's a great listening experience. It's really, really fun. I frankly enjoyed this a lot more than I was expecting to. I was kind of, I don't know why I was expecting to be sort of underwhelmed by this. Maybe it was because, like, I didn't, fully fall head over heels for Acts 4 and 5 through and through the way I was hoping to, though I do think they're mostly great records. But actually, I was just completely on board with this musically. I think that again, paring it back a little bit and really refining the speed of the music and just the pacing and stuff and bringing it into this 50-minute contained space was a really smart move. I just think that there's still some sort of growing pains with exercising this new concept and kind of fleshing it out into making it feel like its own world, as opposed to just another sort of like dystopian sci-fi story by the numbers sort of thing. But I have faith that they will be able to do that, and I'm curious to see. We'll definitely be reviewing the second installment in this series. I think it's called Sunya or something like that when it comes out next year. But for now, this gets a big thumbs up from me. Definitely check it out if you're new to the Deer Hunter and you're kind of overwhelmed and sort of put off by the, I guess, hugeness of the Act series. I would say this is a pretty solid, safe entry point, and worth checking out. And you'll be able to get an idea of whether you're going to vibe with this band or not, from the general tone and experience of listening to this.
It's funny that you said that we were going to have a difference of opinion despite the score, because I literally agree with everything you just said, like literally point by point.
Okay.
If anything, the point in which I get on board the least, I think it has to do with Casey sort of like, it's that he's writing more like broadly. And when I say that, I don't mean that like he's like, casting a wider net to like get people. It's really that like the Act series is like the story of one person going from place to place, and each song is like a chapter. It's a very contained story, and sometimes it'll be from his perspective, sometimes it'll be from the perspective of somebody who finds him or comes across him. And this is more like all encompassing. So I think that maybe there wasn't much of a transition of a moment where, you know, it's just sort of like he's going from one kind of writing style to like the not the opposite, but just something that's completely different from that side of like his wheelhouse. So maybe he's not fully comfortable in this style yet, but in my, like, at least from what I can estimate, it feels like he's going to like maybe grow more comfortable if he indeed wants to keep writing in this way, or maybe he wants to change it up on the next album. Who fucking knows? But that is the only sort of like sticking point, just because I do find this like really musically invigorating and cool. Like songs like Industry, for example, have a really like kind of, yeah, like funk driven swing to them that's just really fucking fun.
For sure.
So yes.
Yeah, I think definitely the closest comparison point that this album has within the Deer Hunter's own discography is naturally Act 1. Yeah, and I think that's where a lot of this sort of, I don't necessarily want to say disconnect, but like disconnect relative to the writing on the other albums, is that Crescenzo has always been character first on the Act albums, and this is definitely like something that is laying the foundation for a world more so than the Act series did. There was a line in a review that said this was like the map at the beginning of a fantasy book, and so yeah, the writing does tend to feel a bit more impersonal than we're used to and maybe would like it to be. But yeah, this is perhaps their most musically accomplished album. It's just like the only hiccup I have really is, I think the track Ring 3 Luxury has a tendency to kind of meander relative to the really well-paced stuff on the rest of the album. And it is the longest thing on here, so that makes sense. And I do like the song, but it doesn't hit the way everything else does. But yeah, this is like a really exciting, intriguing start to this next venture for this band. And even though it's not like life altering like Acts 3, 4, and 5 and the Color Spectrum were for me, I remain just as excited for whatever this band does next as I was for this album.
Same. In fact, if anything, I'm even more excited about like this band than I was before I listened to this, just because I think that demonstrating that they have an aptitude and a skill for incorporating more sort of pop and R&B aesthetics into their music and pulling it off tells me that they still have, I think, a lot of tricks up their sleeve to stay innovative and exciting. And what I really hope more than anything is that they continue in this sort of pop oriented direction with the next record, because I think that they have some real potential to carve out a niche in, alternative pop music, dragging progressive aesthetics towards that in ways that I think could be really, really, really cool. So I hope that they continue to sort of explore out of their comfort zone with this series and continue to carve out a niche for themselves and sort of prove that they're more than just, the Act series band.
This is absolutely an album for people whose one of your favorite songs on Act 5 was Gloria, which is one of my favorite songs.
Great
on
song.
That record.
Great song.
That was like the one song that like felt like the sonic connective tissue between the end of that project and the beginning of this one to me, is that there's a lot of like the more opulent maximalist moments on Act 5 that do feel like they get a bit of a reprisal here, and that is happy for me because I am someone who loves Act 5 about as much as they love Act 4, which is a whole goddamn lot. So yay.
Awesome. All right, shall we do our favorite tracks and ratings then for the Deer Hunters Antimai? Jake, why don't you go first?
I'm going to co-sign what Morgan said and say that my least favorite track is probably Luxury, just because of the runtime. It's the only part on the album that feels like it, like musically, I like it the whole time, but it still feels like the one moment that manages to linger in itself perhaps a bit too long. But my three favorite tracks are going to be Industry, Lowtown, and Patrol. And I give the album a fairly hearty 7 out of 10.
Yeah, my three favorites are, say, Lowtown, Industry, and Nature. Least favorite, Luxury, and this will also get a hearty. You know what? Let's fuck up that standard deviation a little bit. I can give this a 7.5.
Well, you're not going to be fucking it up that much because that's exactly what I'm going to give it to.
Well,
but my three favorite tracks, yes, fuck you. My three favorite tracks are Ring 8, Poverty, great opener, I think. Maybe a little bit underrated relative to some of the, I guess, bigger heavy hitters. I love that song. Also, an underrated song, I think, is Ring 6, Lowtown, which I really enjoy. One of the most musically distinct songs here. And my third favorite will be Ring 1, Tower. Great closer for this thing, I think. Least favorite, I mean, I don't really think I have one. I want to shout out as well, I poo-pooed some of the lyricism a little bit, but I actually think that some of the songs have beautiful and really well articulated and written lyricism. I think that Ring 2, Nature in particular, which kind of takes the perspective of the environment itself, surrounding the kind of like central indigo child tower. I thought that was a really eloquently written song, so shout out to that one too. And I don't have a least favorite. Nothing sticks out to me and as particularly overindulgent in a way that grates on me. So yeah, I really enjoy this thing. I am going to give it a very hearty 7.5, which gives us an average overall of 7.3 for the Deer Hunters Antimai. Moving on then, let's move into our second album discussion for the day. Moor Mother is the artistic pseudonym of one Kame Ayewa, who is a Philadelphia-based hip-hop artist, just general. In fact, it feels, I say that straight off the bat because that's what we, I guess, associate aesthetically the most with what Moor Mother does. And of course, the fact that she does rap and has rapped heavily on her last project, Black Encyclopedia of the Year. But in a lot of ways, genre, I think, is going to be maybe a theme of our discussion here because it is difficult to pigeonhole Kame in any way in particular, because it feels as though she purposefully, I don't want to say tries to necessarily subvert, what is associated with genre, but I guess kind of just tries to escape genre altogether. And her music is a really intriguing fusion of the aesthetics and themes of conscious hip hop and stuff, and rich tapestries of historically Black music, jazz music, for instance, which does come to the forefront here on this record, as you might expect from the title. This is a record where you've had shades of jazz instrumentation and jazz sampling and just jazz aesthetics. Again, I'm going to probably use that word way too much in this segment on previous releases of Moor Mothers. But here it really feels like the most thorough and dense exploration of the aesthetics of jazz, the history of jazz music in terms of how it has functioned as historically and artistically Black through and through form and mode of expression, how the meaning and idea of what jazz is, how jazz can be used, what jazz means as a cultural concept, above and beyond just as a musical style, is something that is of a huge interest to Kame on this record. And you have explorations of the significance of jazz to the Black community, the role that jazz culture and that just generally Black culture as it relates to art and artistic expression currently exists and sort of situates itself in relation to socio-cultural and political issues related to the Black community and to the Black experience in America in particular. This is a very, it feels like I have to get very academic talking about Moor Mother, and I'm not necessarily the most educated, informed, and certainly given the fact that I am white, not necessarily the most ideal person to be kind of expounding on this thing. But, you know, that all said, I find the music of Moor Mother fascinating. And she's been an artist that I have paid attention to somewhat. I was, of course, like many people, like many internet dwelling white people, was drawn to her initially with the collaborative record that she made with Billy Woods in 2020, Brass, which was an excellent album. And then I sort of dipped in a little bit with Black Encyclopedia of the Year, which I thought was a really, really intriguing and unusual record too, that I want to go back and spend more time with now that I've kind of immersed myself in this record. But with Jazz Codes, I can say that I am fully, unequivocally, utterly enthralled by Moor Mother as an artistic presence, as a poet, and as, I guess, an academic in music in a certain sense, as a person who uses music to explore and provoke you to think about certain things as they regard to culture and what aesthetic signifiers of genre mean to us, what genres in general mean to us, what jazz means to us, what hip hop means to us, the relationship between these kind of forms of music and musical culture and, you know, political, social issues. I'm going to start talking myself in a circle here, so I'll sort of back off a little bit. It's a really fascinating record, and I think there is a lot to talk about, not only in terms of some of the things that Moor Mother and her vast list of collaborators explore on the thing, but also just how it sounds as well. Jake, I'm curious what your experience was with this record, given that I just kind of like put it on the docket and said this might be interesting to review. What were you sort of expecting going into it, and what did you find listening to this thing?
Well, I had no prior experience with this artist, and from the album's name, Jazz Codes, I was just like, well, I can only assume that this has something to do with jazz. And so I went in and I listened to it, and it's my sort of leaping off point here will be something I don't normally do, and that'll be talking about the first track and the last track. The first track, Umzanzi, is like this fucking beautiful, like Philip Glass string plucking sound collage thing that is just so shimmering and bright and beautiful and just laden with this melting instrumentation that is like, it was so arresting for this to be the first thing that I heard on this album. I was just like, oh, okay. And if you like the idea of these sort of samples and like vaguely sort of plunderphonics adjacent approach to sound being like the template from which all of these songs are constructed, to the point where this reminded me at several points of Nujabes in many different respects, mainly due to how the features are employed, due to how like just some of the arrangements here really do feel like that sort of like almost like the 21st like sort of century, like, or at least like, you know, the modern equivalent of crate digging to find these samples and sounds to construct these songs with. And something interesting that I find is on the last track here, Thomas Stanley Jazz Codes, is that there's a spoken word piece here talking about jazz as a genre and how jazz sort of has been left behind and kind of forgotten. And then sort of the person speaking talks, I assume the Thomas Stanley in question, talks about why the jazz being left behind and forgotten, specifically why it hasn't been absorbed by capitalism and made popular and put into the mainstream, why that's a good thing, essentially, and why its sort of dead status can be used for, you know, to sort of resurrect in this way by this specific field of artists. And I think that is sort of the thesis statement for this album here is to sort of resurrect jazz in a 21st century context. And as a result, I think the overall sort of vision of this is just beautiful. This is an album that sustains itself wonderfully. It is a fairly brisk 43 minutes, but even then, it feels a lot longer than that. And I mean that in the best way possible, in that you just sort of bathe in these sound collages. And there's a lot of really thoughtful meditation on jazz and music and the state of modern racial oppression happening from who I assume is Miss Moor Mother, who speaks from a particularly like refreshingly wizened perspective on all of these subjects. Her voice, both like lyrically speaking, is really like thoughtful, but also like her flow is really great, and how it rides a lot of these really unconventionally structured songs, because they don't necessarily always have like a traditional beat, but she's usually rapping or at least kind of speak singing on these tracks, but in a way that feels very accessible, in a way that I don't feel is that far apart from like the drumless hip hop of somebody like Earl Sweatshirt. I feel like fans of him would be right at home here. But that even then, it's like or even like Billy Woods, for example, lyricism wise especially. But I think the approach to production is like light years away from that in terms of how much more color is here. Those other albums can be a little bit darker, a little bit more monotone to their benefit. But here it feels distinctly a little bit more vibrant. Not to mention the variety of features here also just adds a real dynamism to these tracks that they don't always contribute in ways that are like totally obvious, but they're always in ways that make you feel like they are in fact distinct. I think one of the most interesting thematic topics this album covers is the sort of desire to make jazz and to make music like this in a modern context that sort of clashes with the idea of making it in like a modern sort of thematic, explicitly kind of racial context. I get the impression from some tracks here that Moor Mother feels kind of torn in between the desire to make music that speaks to this one part of her cultural identity and a desire to make music that like she doesn't want to feel bound or limited by that one constraint. She wants to make music about, life and love and things that are untethered from this very specific thing, and that rears its head very occasionally, and I think really compellingly too. And the sort of variety that's on here, I think, showcases that desire while simultaneously not abandoning speaking to her cultural roots. And just generally speaking, like whenever there's like a squonking saxophone on here, it fills that kind of jazz-like void in me that just really this is. Did
this
motherfucker
album just say squonking?
Tell me, listen to this album and fucking tell me that's not exactly what the saxophone sounds like on a song like April 7th.
Squonk is also the name of a Genesis song that was referenced in the Steely Dan song. Which fucking song was it? Any Major Dude Will Tell You. So it's a great word that I love to hear referenced. Yeah.
But I mean, it's true. That's what it sounds like. But there are also just like really thoughtful jazz piano passages on songs like Ode to Mary. Like this is just one of the most creative albums I have heard all year. It never stops being compelling. It is fully immersive, and it's a combination of lots of familiar things that I like, but in a way that I just haven't heard before. So honestly, I really fell in love with this album.
Yeah, me too. I want to explore the concept a little bit more because I've been thinking about this a lot and sort of trying to, because it's a dense record. There's a lot going on musically, and there's a lot of significance to the way in which jazz is deployed here, the way in which the record is produced, the way in which the songs are composed and cut together and all that sort of thing. And the title, I think, is really the skeleton key to the whole thing. Jazz codes, not just like jazz music, but like interrogating how jazz is defined and what jazz means. And one of the interesting threads here is if you think about the history of jazz music, I guess the cultural place that jazz music has had. Obviously, it's a culturally, historically black form of music, through and through. And it is a form of music that has fallen out of fashion somewhat in the cultural sphere. I mean, by the time you get to the fusion era of the 70s, jazz was changing, had already changed rapidly. And vastly, and you had jazz scholars in the 60s and 70s who even then, what we think of now in the modern day as a kind of golden era of jazz, because it's the era that's most widely recorded on record, and is the era that's easiest to kind of associate with certain terms of influences in Western white music, I suppose. But even then, in the 60s and 70s, a lot of jazz scholars, black jazz scholars, were alienated by the direction that jazz was moving in. And jazz moved so quickly and violently, and really at the hands of a small number of very famous band leaders, that the meaning of what jazz was changed so drastically in such a short period of time, both aesthetically and culturally, that as a result, jazz kind of became left behind. Jazz was this huge cultural fixture for the Black community. I mean, throughout the early 20th century, and arguably that was a huge fixture of culture and music for such a long period of time. And then essentially, as it became more and more and more fashionable for wider audiences and more kind of infiltrated by, I suppose, white Western aesthetics, jazz suddenly, or at least some members of the Black community and Black jazz scholars, felt that jazz was losing some inherent, Blackness that it had, or I guess losing its roots in some way, or becoming something that was so radically shifted from what it once was that it no longer resembled jazz. And that's a part of the narrative of jazz's, I suppose, cultural decline somewhat, is that it's not that white people or white sort of cultural tastemakers lost interest in jazz. It's just that the vocal jazz community became alienated from what jazz was, and what jazz essentially became popular jazz anyway, in as much as there was popular jazz in the 80s and 90s, essentially became a parody of jazz, because it was smooth jazz, it was soft jazz, it was all this very sort of gentrified anodyne shit essentially, and real, quote unquote, real jazz, as it was to the Black community, was sort of buried and I guess forgotten in a lot of ways. And look, I'm no jazz scholar, so this is just my understanding, my perspective from what I have learned and read. So my word is not bond, it's just what I gather, and I'd be happy to be educated on this by someone who knows more than me. But anyway, the reason why I bring up this history of jazz is that I think it's obviously relevant to the concept of the record and to the broader thing that Moor Mother is trying to do with this album, and the relationship she sees between jazz culture, jazz aesthetics, and the really sort of rife and strong and emotional issues of Black identity and Black power and Black ownership and Black self-love and communal love as well, that are really sort of pressing and vital and very, very intimate issues that are coming through in a lot of Black art at the moment. And so what that is that, from what I can gather, I see Moor Mother's attitude here towards this cultural shift in the way that jazz has been talked about. I think that she is deeply disheartened by the way that jazz has kind of been forgotten by the Black community to a certain extent. How sort of cultural infighting and ideas of like what is true or authentic as it regards to a particular mode of expression or aesthetic within that community has, so much sort of back and forth about what's authentic or what's real jazz or what jazz even is, has as a result kind of caused the collapse of the form itself, essentially, and the fading of relevance. And you can kind of see, not that much, not as strongly, but you can kind of see how in maybe 10, 20 years, a similar thing might happen with hip hop as well. The further along a form of culture progresses, especially when it originates within a particular community and in a particular time and cultural space, further it drifts from that, the more alienated certain people who are connected to that original time are going to be. And so what I think this record is it's essentially a call to arms from Kame to say essentially to the community to think a little bit more about what jazz actually represents, what jazz actually means, and how the shifting of how jazz sounds, how jazz is performed, is not losing essentially the cultural roots of it, the history of it. It's just evolving and keeping it relevant and keeping it true to the way in which Black culture and Black society is evolving and changing with the times as well. And it is essentially like a form of I guess, radical, progressive doctrine from Kame to people, or I guess to ideas of conservatism within, the artistic landscape within this community, essentially saying. And so what she's doing here is she is deliberately sampling and recording and including all of this sort of jazz instrumentation in this purposefully very formless way. Like there are really no conventional jazz arrangements on this album. You just have swirling saxophones and trumpets and drums and keys and all these sorts of sounds that we associate with jazz, but they're not really glued together in any way. It's just kind of like drony at certain points. It's eerie, it's atmospheric. It has no real sense of structural tether. And that, I think, in the way that Kame orchestrates and arranges that, is a form of kind of radical jazz expression. Is her essentially, leading the way by example, showcasing that this is what my jazz is essentially. And it is no less Black, it is no less authentic, it is no less real, it is no less vital than what jazz may be to purists, or what, any form of, I guess, inherently, intrinsically, culturally associated art is to that group. And it is, I see it as, anyway, my interpretation is that the whole point of this record is essentially to encourage not only self-love, which is something that Kame talks about on this record as well. She talks a lot about how the Black community, and I suppose racial communities within the US in general, have been divided a lot by some very, as I think she sees them, tangential and sort of minuscule and even maybe kind of not genuinely meaningful issues have kind of torn at the seams of the community, or little divisions have been put into the community that, as she sees it, is kind of working against, greater harmony and working against the greater goals of overcoming systemic oppression, essentially. And so this is, I think, another piece of art in the abstract hip hop lane. A lot of artists who do kind of talk about this sort of thing about contemporary Black issues as they relate to identity, both, how you identify in terms of your own experience, and also how, communities identify and establish a sense of camaraderie and a sense of like unity. And so I think this is a kind of record that speaks to the desire for Black unity, the desire for cultural assimilation within a community, the desire for unification and strength in numbers, the importance of understanding the importance of your culture and the importance of your ethnicity, if you are to truly love yourself, to be able to embrace that and not to kind of shy away from it, or not to kind of allow it to be diluted by, systemic forces. It's really a record that I think is about all of these things, about like how important it is to reassess what is, truly meaningful and what's truly important, and also to not lose culture by holding it to a particular standard that limits what it can be. And so I think that, with a record like this, essentially it is, I suppose in a lot of ways, the most progressive jazz record I maybe have ever heard, in a certain sense, because it is totally taking jazz apart. It's not even like a jazz rap album, essentially, where you have some low-key jazz, instrumentation and beats that, supplement these, conventional hip hop tracks. It is a total deconstruction of the jazz form, and it's neither really hip hop nor is it really jazz, but it gives you an interesting vision of both of these things, the potential future of them, and how they can coexist, and how essentially, the sky is the limit, and there's still so much more that's possible, and it's and again, it's not a record that's for me, it's not a record that's for any of us here really, but it is a record I think that we can appreciate for the meaning that it has. And again, just my interpretation and based on things that I've read about it and about Kame herself as an artist, I think it's a really important album. And I know that's kind of a fucking annoying, kind of meaningless word to lob, like important, like, but I think it kind of is. I think it kind of is a record that we should pay attention to, or it showcases why we should pay attention to artists like Moor Mother, because they have distinctly interesting and original visions of a cultural direction forward, and the relationship between art and ethnicity, the relationship between art and community. And yeah, it's it's a lot, and I've done my typical thing of going completely overboard and interpreting it, but it's just such a fascinating album.
No matter what we say on here, I think that the point is that when it cuts down to brass tacks, what we're saying is that you need to hear this.
Oh,
that's it.
Yeah, and I mean, like, just to get away from all the hugely conceptual shit and just talk about tangible things on this record, there's so much to love about how this record sounds and about the ideas and execution on this record. The performances of Moor Mother herself, which range from, as you say, sort of more spoken word sort of stuff to conventional rapping. I think that the way that features are deployed here, there's a feature on 17 out of the 18 tracks on this record in some form. So it is a record about community. Like what I talk about sort of assimilation and reconciliation within a community, and I guess unification, Moor Mother is essentially, that is reflected in the way in which this is such a communal record. It's full of all these different voices. A lot of the time, the voices are overlapping with each other at certain points. And you just have some utterly stunning, like some of the most formless moments here are some of the most stunning, like April 7th, for instance, the second track here, just an absolute kaleidoscope of gorgeous droning bliss. Like and the sentiments here, sing the song, ladies, sing the song, let them know. It wasn't the drugs, what they can do to you is stronger than any drug. There's a huge sort of spiritual sensibility that comes through here in ways that actually remind me of, and again, maybe this is just because there's very few female Black jazz artists that come to mind because of the way that culture is, but I am reminded of Alice Coltrane to a certain extent, not just because of female figures in the jazz adjacent world, but also because they both have, I think, a heavy interest in spiritualist themes, in the relationship between the divine and the type of music they're going to make as well, like the divinity in jazz, I suppose. Big thing that comes through here. Meditation Rag is another great track that I think really brings that forward as well. Talks a lot about name drops a lot of significant historical jazz figures and locations. It's kind of like a whirlwind trip across, the 20th century America. It's really great shit. And the track, I think that the most sort of standout immediate track here, for multiple reasons, is the kind of centerpiece song Rap Jasm, which is a great little pun. And this is really notable because it has a feature from an artist called Akai Solo. And again, I have to say that I'm not familiar with any of the feature artists across this record. So it's awesome to be getting introduced to these figures who wouldn't otherwise really be getting a foot in popular culture. But anyway, it has this feature from Akai Solo, which is, this is my favorite rap verse of the year. I haven't heard a better verse this year so far from anyone. This is both in terms of technicality. He is an incredibly technically proficient performer. His rhyme schemes are incredibly complicated and satisfying. His vocabulary is fantastic, and as well as the significance and meaning and semantics of the things he's communicating as well. Like, I'm just going to read some lyrics and just try and hopefully give you the impression of what he gives off. Constantly at odds with his crew and his empress, hardly concerned with impressions, oblivious to the fact that he could lead better ones before the paint, the color of the hate dries, before it's all said and never done, before you live your best life, before we all capsize. And later in the verse, he has this great little part where he's like, group dynamics tend to wither at my feet. Seeds I thought that I planted, actually channels dismantled. No use for them, like shrunken flannels. Flanders get planted, passed by, they passed phantoms. No plans for that. Trauma rich geared towards us, coalescing like plasma. The right response being selected, rarer than sight and silverbacks. Facts, you quiver quicker than a shivering pet. he just goes off, and it's like it, flies through your head, but then you sit down and read it and it makes perfect sense. And the way that all the best sort of abstract rappers do, you are just kind of so bombarded by the technicality, and then you go back and you see the substance within it. It is actually kind of, in his cadence and in some of his rhyme scheme choices and the things that he does, it is actually kind of Earl Sweatshirt-esque now that I think about it. But yeah, that's immediately stood out to me. Another highlight is the next track, Blues Away, as well, which utilizes a feature from Fatboy Sharif, where he just kind of like does this sort of like moaning, sort of pained expression of the blues being taken away from him, essentially, like the sense that this form of expression has been co-opted and removed from what this person sees as their form, essentially, and as alien to them now, essentially. And so that ties in a lot to a lot of what is this record is about on a lot of the other tracks. You took the blues away from me, and my heart can't sing, and the band won't play. I don't feel no ways. It's quite intense, and it's a lot. And yeah, and I mean, it continues to be like, there's some really interesting, more sort of, I guess, topical considerations of the, I guess, surface level infighting and the sort of destructive cultural forces of some of the things that are dominating online discourse at the moment, in the song Barely Woke, which talks about, I guess, how, I mean, for starters, how the term woke, which is goes back years as a form of African American vernacular English, has kind of been co-opted by white people, by people across America, essentially, and turned into this kind of poisoned phrase, essentially. And how this idea of moral purity, I suppose, has taken from this language and this tradition that's been used by the Black community, and kind of like just bastardized it, essentially. And it's a really, really powerful song for that reason. And yeah, and I think, Jake, you mentioned the closing track, the Thomas Stanley Jazz Codes outro, which kind of brings it all full circle, right? Because we've had this record that explores, what jazz is and what jazz can be, and all the sort of limitations of the way that people think about jazz. And then this is this lecture from a professor who teaches at the Mason School of Arts in Virginia. I looked him up, and he has taught and researched extensively about spiritual jazz. He's got a lot of work on Sun Ra and the relationship between jazz and funk as well. And so he has this little speech here at this closing track where he talks about the origins of what jazz is, essentially, as a term, as a phrase, and how it relates to, in its original form, is kind of used to reference sort of eroticism and sexuality, and this kind of like primal, lusty sort of desire and impulse and like relation between people, this communal thing that brings people together in the context of the most fiery connection possible. And that is what jazz music is for a lot of people, and has been for a lot of people, is this form of expression that kind of channels this primal human emotion and urge and desire and just feeling, and is a form of bringing people together through the catharsis of sharing in that. And so it's a really interesting exploration of the etymology of jazz, what jazz maybe originally was, and in the context of this record and all the other things that Moor Mother has explored, what jazz can continue to be, and how jazz can if fully embraced, can be a force of unification, can be a force of strength for its community, for the Black community. So yeah, it's a big ass album with a lot of shit happening in it, and we're not particularly educated enough to necessarily go into a huge amount of depth, but hopefully what I've said makes sense. And hopefully, if there's fans of Moor Mother out there that are listening, hopefully it was cogent, and hopefully it tracks with the way you understand the music. Whether or not it does, I'd love to hear from you in the comments about what Moor Mother does, and what your thoughts are on her vision and her art, and what this record is all about. But I am just taken with this. It's one of the best albums of the year. It is definitely a record where individual tracks and that sort of thing matter less than just putting this thing on and just letting it sort of take you over for a while and just kind of like bathing in it. And it's a fantastic experience. I cannot say enough good things about it. All right. Well, shall we do our favorite tracks and ratings then for Jazz Codes? My favorite tracks are, again, in as much as I can take any individual tracks out and cite them, but I'm going to say April 7th, Meditation Rag and Rap Jasm. No least favorite, and this gets a very emphatic 8.5 out of 10 from me.
My three favorite tracks, I gotta rep the aforementioned rap jazzism.
Well, there's a song called Rap Jasm, and then there's a song called Noise Jism. So, yeah,
well,
easy to get the two mixed up.
The rap one, and the other tracks I'll pick, I'll say, April 7th, and while I would normally say Meditation Rag, I'm gonna go with the very underrated Ode to Mary.
Right.
And my least favorite track is it's probably Noise Jism. That one at the end. It's cute, but like it's the only point on it. It's a minute long, but it's like the only point on the album that I'm just not overwhelmingly just, willing to vomit praise on. And I give the album an 8 out of 10.
It feels like a moment where like the whole aesthetic of the album and like the sonic palette is being used to like represent a musical orgasm for just 1 minute.
A little bit like
it's literally a noise jism. Anyway, so that gives us
what was it like again, Jake? There we go.
So that gives us a rating overall of 8.3 for Moor Mother's Jazz Codes. Let us know at home what you think of either of the records we've discussed today, the Deer Hunters Antimai and Moor Mother's Jazz Codes. We want to hear from you. These are both super conceptual, dense records with lots to potentially be said on them. And of course, we only have our own perspectives. So we want to hear what you thought of them in the comments below. If you're listening on Apple or on Spotify, you can head on over to the YouTube link in the description and you can leave us a like and a comment via that medium. We'd really, really appreciate it. If you enjoy what we do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you have not already. And to those of you who have, thanks a bunch. If you want to go above and beyond and support us even more, you can hit the join button. And for just $1 a month, you can support us directly, get your name put in the title crawl of every video on this channel, plus get emojis of our faces to use in the comments. Plus, if you want to recommend us some music to listen to, your recommendation will go to the top of the pile. As always, though, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Audi, advancement through technology.